Imagine standing in front of, I mean, literally 15,000 people who are just begging to make you king.
Right.
You have absolute power right there in your grasp. The crowd is, they're at a fever pitch.
Oh, yeah, they are ready.
Exactly. They are ready to overthrow an oppressive empire, and they have chosen you as their unquestioned leader. All you have to do is nod.
Just say the word.
Just say the word. And your very first move, instead of taking the crown, is to shove your closest friends onto a boat into a gathering storm, tell the massive crowd to go home, and just walk away into the dark. Entirely alone.
It is wild.
It really is. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are unpacking what has to be the ultimate anti-marketing move in human history.
Yeah, it really is a moment that defies, well, basically every conventional rule of leadership and momentum.
And common sense, honestly.
Right, exactly. We are looking at Mark chapter 6, specifically verses 45 and 46. And, if you are just skimming the gospel narrative, these two verses, they just look like simple travel logistics.
That's a quick transition.
Exactly, just a bridge. It bridges the gap between the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 and that famous moment where Jesus walks on water. It reads like a mere itinerary.
But the sources we are diving into today for this deep dive argue something very different, right?
They do. They argue that this specific moment, this little transitional bridge, is actually a profound theological goldmine. It completely shatters our modern assumptions about success, about suffering, and really the sovereignty of God.
So to understand why the incarnate Son of God would deliberately dismantle his own massive public triumph, we really have to put ourselves on the ground in first century Judea.
We have to understand the context.
Right. We need to smell the dust, feel the tension in the air. Jesus has just performed this creation-level miracle on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee near Bethsaida.
Yeah, he took 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and multiplied them.
To feed 5,000 men. And, when you factor in the women and children who were definitely present, we are talking about a crowd of anywhere from 10 to 15,000 people.
Which is staggering. A crowd of that size in a desolate, uncultivated area, that is a logistical impossibility.
A complete nightmare.
Right, which makes the miracle itself so amazing. But to really grasp the crowd's reaction, you have to understand the political powder keg they were living in.
Paint that picture for us.
Well, first century Galilee was not this peaceful, pastoral landscape that we sometimes see in Sunday school pictures. It was intensely volatile. Rome is the occupying force, and their taxation system is, it's absolutely crushing the Jewish populace.
It's an agrarian society.
Exactly. Most families are living at bare subsistence levels. They are barely scraping by. And the Roman war machine, through all these tributes and local tolls, is just siphoning off their resources.
And then on top of Rome, you have the local puppet government.
Right. Governing locally under Rome's thumb is the Herodian dynasty, specifically Herod Antipas.
And Herod Antipas has just done something absolutely horrifying right before this.
He has.
He hasn't just raised taxes. He just executed John the Baptist.
Yeah, he had him beheaded. And he did it at this corrupt, lust-driven, drunken banquet.
So if you're a peasant in Galilee in that moment, you're terrified.
Completely.
You're oppressed financially, and your primary spiritual leader has just been violently murdered by a tyrant.
And that terror, that oppression, that is exactly what fuels this thing called zealot fever.
Zealot fever.
Right. There are active insurgency movements brewing in the hills of Galilee. The people are desperate. They are not looking for, a mild spiritual counselor.
No, they want a warrior.
Exactly. They want a military political messiah to rise up, crush the Roman legions, overthrow the corrupt Herodian rulers, and restore the earthly glory of the kingdom of Israel.
They want a new King David.
Yes, someone to lead them into battle.
So when this stadium-sized crowd sees a man who can literally create food out of thin air, their minds do not go to the sin-bearing lamb of Isaiah 53, who will atone for their spiritual rebellion.
No, not at all.
They see the ultimate quartermaster for a revolutionary army. Think about it. If you have a leader who can feed an army infinitely from a single basket of rations, you can march on Rome tomorrow.
Right, because logistics win wars.
Right. Logistics win wars, and this man has infinite logistics. It makes me think of, imagine a stadium of fans.
Okay.
Like they are at a pop concert. The pop star puts on this amazing, mind-blowing show, And the crowd gets so hyped that they try to forcefully elect that pop star as a wartime president right then and there.
Just based on the concert.
Exactly. Just because they threw an amazing concert. It's a complete mismatch of mission and expectation.
That is a great analogy. And, the parallel account in the Gospel of John explicitly confirms this carnal motivation.
What does John say?
John tells us that the crowd was intending to come and seize Jesus by force to make him king.
Seize him by force. Wow.
Yeah, they wanted to install him as an earthly ruler right on the spot. They were projecting their own political desires onto his divine mission. And our sources point out that the author of this gospel, Mark, is intentionally building a really brilliant literary contrast here.
Oh, so?
Well, he juxtaposes two banquets in this chapter to highlight this exact tension.
Oh, right. The first banquet being Herod's, the one that ended in John the Baptist's death.
Exactly. Herod's banquet takes place in this palatial stronghold. It's characterized by earthly tyranny, lust, political manipulation, and of course, it culminates in the bloody murder of God's prophet.
It's the absolute pinnacle of worldly power.
Yes, and worldly corruption. The whole paradigm of Caesar and Herod is that power means domination and violence. But then immediately following that scene, Mark presents Christ's banquet.
What's the total opposite?
Right. It takes place in a desolate wilderness, not a palace. It is characterized by divine compassion and miraculous provision. It brings life and sustenance to the weary instead of death.
So the tension is really between two entirely different types of kingdoms.
Precisely.
The crowd is completely stuck in the paradigm of Herod. They think the only way to beat Herod is to get a bigger, stronger, more magical Herod.
They want the redemptive kingdom turned into a carnal political one.
But Jesus is establishing a kingdom, just not one that will be ushered in by a mob of Galilean zealots with swords.
Right. His kingdom is going to be ushered in through perfect obedience, immense suffering, the cross, and the resurrection.
The people want the crown without the cross.
They do. And this volatile political reality, this intense pressure from the crowd, it explains the sudden, drastic action Jesus takes with his inner circle in verse 45.
Let's look at the text of verse 45. It says that Jesus immediately compelled his disciples to get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side.
The Greek adverb used there is euthes.
Euthes, which means immediately, right?
Right, immediately, without a single moment of hesitation. It shows there's a sudden, urgent crisis. But the verb that follows is even more intense. The word is anankazou.
Anankaios. Unpack that for us.
So, anankazou translates to compelled or forced. It denotes a very strong constraint. It implies an authoritative insistence that borders on physical force.
Wow.
Jesus is not saying, hey guys, the event is over, let's head out. He is issuing an unyielding, mandatory command. He's making them leave.
But wait, forced? Why use such a violent, coercive word? I mean, these are the disciples.
True.
They left their nets, they left their families, their whole livelihoods, just to follow him. If he just suggested they leave, surely they would have obeyed, right? Why did he have to force them into the boat?
You have to consider who the disciples were. They were Galilean Jews. They were raised in the exact same political climate, suffering under the exact same oppression as the crowd.
So they felt it too.
Absolutely. They were completely susceptible to this nationalistic zealot fever. And look at what they had just experienced.
It's a miracle.
Even before that. Just days prior, they returned from a highly successful ministry tour casting out demons. And now they get to be the actual physical distributors of this miraculous bread.
They are riding the absolute high of the crowd's adulation.
They really are. They're essentially minor celebrities at this point.
Yeah, I mean, they are looking at this massive crowd ready to crown Jesus, and they are doing the math.
Right.
They're thinking, this is it. The revolution is starting today. And when he takes the throne in Jerusalem, well, we are the inner circle.
We are going to be the generals.
Exactly. We're the cabinet members. We'll be sitting at his right and left.
Their psychology in this moment is completely aligned with the mob, not with the cross. So they were dragging their feet. They did not want to leave the momentum.
They wanted to stay and soak it all in.
Exactly. And the authors of our sources emphasize that Christ exercised absolute unilateral authority here for a reason.
Yep.
He had to protect his disciples from a toxic, carnal influence that they were simply not spiritually mature enough to resist.
If they had stayed on that shore for another hour,
They would have been swept up in the mob.
they would have joined the rebellion.
They absolutely would have.
So he had to forcefully remove them for their own spiritual safety. He is insulating them. I mean, he is training apostles, not campaign managers for a political insurrection.
That's a great way to put it.
But, this brings up a terrifying realization about God's providence, according to the sources.
It does.
Because he forces them into a boat. He commands them to row across the Sea of Galilee. It is evening. And Jesus knows exactly what is brewing over that water. He deliberately sends them into a physical hurricane.
Yeah, this is one of the most towering theological implications of the text. Jesus spares them from the political storm on the shore, only to command them directly into a life-threatening meteorological storm on the sea.
It's hard to wrap your mind around.
It is, but it teaches us that Christ will ordain physical hardship to prepare us for spiritual maturity. The disciples were in that boat, battling for their lives against contrary winds, not because they had strayed from God's will.
Right, not because they sinned.
Precisely because they obeyed Christ's command.
See, we so often assume that if we are obeying God, if we are in His will, our lives should just be smooth sailing.
A literal gentle breeze.
Right. But here, the storm is a divine classroom. The sources point out that Christ governs the boat, He governs the wind, the timing, and He governs the lesson itself.
He needed to strip away their self-reliance. He had to tear down their earthly illusions of grandeur.
Because you can't hold on to dreams of political dominance when you are bailing water out of a sinking boat in the pitch black.
You really can't. The storm was an instrument of grace, even though it felt like absolute judgment in the moment.
So once He secures their departure into this ordained trial, Jesus turns back to face the mob. We have thousands of hyped-up revolutionaries ready to force a crown onto His head.
And this brings us to what you called earlier the ultimate anti-marketing move.
Right, in verse 45b and 46a. The text says that He remained behind until He Himself dismissed the crowd.
The Greek text uses the emphatic pronoun here, autos, meaning He Himself.
So He doesn't delegate this to anyone.
No. And He doesn't just slip away quietly into the shadows and let the crowd slowly realize He's gone, let them just naturally dissipate.
He steps right into the middle of this frenzied multitude. He stands between the departing boat and the mob, and He single-handedly disbands them.
Yeah, the verb apoliai is used here. It's a historical present tense that vividly describes a complete authoritative dissolution of an assembly.
Just one man.
One man standing before thousands of people who are essentially ready to riot in his favor, and He shuts it down completely. And our sources point out another crucial Greek word used to describe this dismissal.
Which word is that?
Apotaximenos.
Now, in Greek grammar, that is a middle participle, right?
Yeah.
Meaning the action inherently reflects back on the subject.
Exactly.
So He isn't just like waving goodbye to them and saying, see you tomorrow.
Precisely. Because of that middle voice, a middle participle indicates that the subject is acting in a way that intimately involves or affects themselves. Apotaximenos literally means having taken leave of, or having formally said farewell.
But it goes deeper than a simple farewell.
It does. In this context, it carries the weight of a formal, personal renunciation.
A renunciation.
Yes. He is severing ties. He is actively, personally tearing himself away from their agenda. He is formally detaching himself from their carnal expectations.
He is telling them with absolute finality that He will not be the earthly king they demand.
Right.
Think about the sheer absurdity of this from a modern pragmatic perspective.
It makes no sense to the modern mind.
Right. It is like, imagine a struggling tech startup that finally releases a product that goes universally viral.
Okay. Yeah.
They suddenly have millions of active users, venture capitalists are throwing term sheets at them, the IPO is going to be worth billions.
Everything they ever wanted.
Everything. And the CEO walks into the server room, looks at the skyrocketing metrics, and intentionally unplugs all the servers with his own hands.
Just tears the cords out.
Exactly. Rips them out of the wall. And when the board of directors demands to know why he just committed corporate suicide, he says, because the users don't understand our company's true mission.
The board would think he was insane.
They would have him committed. It is entirely contrary to how the world, and unfortunately how much of the modern church, measures success.
It really is fascinating to see how the authors of our sources wield this specific passage. They use it as a devastating critique against modern seeker-sensitive pragmatism.
Now, whether you, listening to this, agree with their theology or not, their argument is incredibly pointed.
It is. We have to look at what they're actually saying. They claim that in today's evangelical landscape, church growth experts evaluate spiritual success almost entirely by metrics.
They look at the size of the crowd, the annual budget, the social media reach, the cultural applause.
Exactly. And the underlying methodology there often dictates that whatever works to attract a massive crowd must inherently be blessed by God.
The metric becomes the master.
Right. And the sources argue that if a modern church strategist were standing on the shore of Galilee that day, they would have told Jesus, he was destroying his own ministry.
Oh, without a doubt. They would have formed a retention committee immediately.
Yes. They would have suggested a whole sermon series on the leadership secrets of the bread king.
Oh, man, definitely. But the authors contend that Christ forcefully dismissed his largest crowd because truth governs mission, not numbers.
Numerical enthusiasm is not the same thing as spiritual understanding.
Wow, say that again.
Numerical enthusiasm is not the same thing as spiritual understanding. A massive gathering of people can still fundamentally misunderstand who Christ is.
The sources argue that Jesus refused to soften his doctrine or leverage popular culture to build an earthly empire. He refused to market the miracle.
Because a massive response can actually be spiritually hollow. The authors of our deep dive sources argue that faithfulness should never be measured by attendance.
Which is a tough pill to swallow today.
It is. But look at Jesus. He had profound compassion on this crowd. I mean, he had just fed them all. But part of that perfect compassion was loving them enough to refuse their false expectations.
He loved them enough to say no to their idolatry.
Exactly. So he dismantled the earthly kingdom below. He sent away human company. He severed ties with that false momentum. And having done all of that, he turns toward the heavenly kingdom above.
And that brings us to verse 46b. The text says, he went away into the mountain to pray.
The Greek there is aperchomais to oros prosostai.
Meaning, he departed into the mountain in order to pray.
Right, and this introduces a really profound moment of redemptive historical typology.
Okay, let's unpack that. When you say mountain and bread in the wilderness, the original Jewish readers of Mark's gospel would immediately have a specific historical figure flash into their minds.
They absolutely would. They would immediately think of Moses.
Oh, Moses.
Yes. In biblical theology, a type is a historical event or a person or an institution that prophetically foreshadows a greater reality to come.
So Moses led the Israelites into the wilderness. God provided manna from heaven.
Bread in the wilderness.
Right. And then Moses ascended Mount Sinai to meet with God and intercede for the people.
So Jesus is deliberately acting as the greater Moses here. He provides the miraculous bread, and then he ascends the mountain.
But the sources highlight a monumental difference between Moses and Jesus in this typology, don't they?
They do. It's a crucial distinction. Moses was a sinful servant. When he approached God on Sinai, he was terrified.
Because of his own sin.
Right. He needed the blood of animal sacrifices to cover his own sins before he could even attempt to mediate for the people.
But Jesus
ascends this Galilean mountain not as a sinful servant, but as the sinless sovereign son over his own house. He does not need blood atonement for himself. He is the perfect, unblemished mediator.
But this raises a question, and I know it trips up a lot of people when they read the Gospels, and our sources address this deeply.
Like a common question, yeah.
If Jesus is fully God, if he possesses the undivided divine nature, equal in power and glory with the Father, why does he need to escape to a mountain to pray?
Right. People wonder that.
Doesn't the act of praying imply dependence? Doesn't it imply a lack of power or, some sort of weakness?
It is a vital question because misunderstanding this leads to really severe errors about who Christ is. The sources emphasize that Christ's prayer is not evidence of an inferior divine essence.
Jesus is not less than the Father.
Never. Rather, his prayer is the ultimate proof of his true, perfect humanity. We are talking about the doctrine of the hypostatic union.
The hypostatic union. Two natures, one person.
Exactly. Jesus is one person with two distinct natures, fully God and fully man.
And they are united without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation.
Perfectly stated. According to his divine nature, he shares the one being and omnipotence of God. But according to his human nature, and specifically in his role as the mediator, he lived a life of perfect covenantal obedience.
Because he became human, he experienced true human dependence.
Yes. So he isn't praying because he suddenly lost access to his divine power. He is praying because, as the perfect human, this is what perfect humanity was designed to do.
Commune with the Father.
In total joyful dependence. Think about Adam, the first human.
Okay.
Adam was placed in a paradise, and he grasped at forbidden advancement. He rebelled to become a king on his own terms.
He reached for the crown.
Right. Now look at Jesus, the second Adam. He is placed in a desolate wilderness. He refuses an illegitimate earthly crown from a massive mob, and instead, he bows in prayerful submission to the Father's will.
It's the exact reverse of the fall.
It is. He is actively relying on the Father to fulfill the redemptive mission. He is embracing the path of suffering rather than grasping for earthly power.
So while Jesus is experiencing this perfect, unbroken Trinitarian communion on the quiet, elevated peak of the mountain,
The disciples are in a very different situation.
yeah, they're experiencing absolute terrifying chaos down below on the sea. They are battered by wind and waves. They are straining at the oars in the pitch black, making zero progress.
And this brings us to some of the most intense applications our sources draw from this narrative.
The authors use this exact juxtaposition, right? The trained Christ on the mountain and the suffering disciples in the storm.
Yes, and they use it to systematically confront several major theological trends in the modern church. The authors basically view this text as a divine sledgehammer against contemporary theological errors.
Okay, let's get into that. What's the first movement they target?
The first one is the prosperity gospel, which is often known as word of faith theology.
Now, just to define that for the listener, the prosperity gospel essentially claims that faith guarantees physical ease, financial wealth, and freedom from severe trials.
Right. The underlying logic is a strict formula.
If you have enough faith, and if you are perfectly in God's will, your life will be blessed with smooth sailing. Suffering is viewed as a lack of faith, or maybe a direct result of hidden sin.
And our sources argue that this passage completely obliterates that formula because we have to look at the chain of events. The disciples did not end up in a terrifying, life-threatening storm because they rebelled.
They didn't do anything wrong.
Exactly. They were in that storm precisely because they obeyed Christ. Remember the violent force of that Greek word anenkazu?
He compelled them into the boat.
Right. If the prosperity formula was true, their obedience in getting into the boat should have resulted in glass-calm waters and a gentle tailwind.
But instead, obedience led directly into a hurricane.
The authors point out that obedience to Christ does not insulate you from earthly tempests. In fact, often it is the very thing that leads you directly into them.
The hardship was sovereignly ordained by Christ to refine their faith and strip away their pride.
Therefore, the sources argue judging God's favor by the comfort of your present circumstances is a severe theological error. The storm does not mean God has abandoned you.
It may mean God is sanctifying you. That is a massive paradigm shift.
Right.
I mean, if you assume that obeying God means a stress-free life, you are going to experience a complete crisis of faith when the wind starts howling.
You'll think you did something wrong.
Right, when in reality, you did exactly what you were commanded to do. And that leads directly into the second polemic our sources construct.
Yes, they contend that this passage refutes modern trends associated with the social gospel and frameworks like critical race theory within the church.
Now, this is a nuanced argument, and we are just reporting what the sources say here.
Right, we are just breaking down their argument. It hinges on understanding the nature of the crowd's demand and Christ's violent rejection of it.
Because the crowd on the shore wanted civil dominance.
They wanted a structural social revolution where they were no longer oppressed by the systemic power of Rome. They wanted earthly liberation.
Which, on a human level, is completely understandable.
Yeah.
Rome was brutal. Their taxation was oppressive.
It is entirely understandable. But the sources argue that by turning his back on the crowd's desire for an earthly political kingdom, Jesus proves that his primary mission is not societal restructuring.
His mission is strict spiritual redemption through the cross.
Exactly. The authors view the modern social gospel as a contemporary echo of the crowd's carnal demand for a bread king.
So the argument is that mapping sociological frameworks onto Christ's redemptive work, or, say, reducing the church's mission to earthly political activism, is a fundamental mistake.
According to the sources, yes, because Jesus himself forcefully rejected that exact pressure from the Galilean peasants.
The sources contend that Jesus refused to be merely an earthly social reformer.
I mean, he could have ended Roman oppression with a single word. He could have established a perfect geopolitical state that very afternoon.
But he dismissed the crowd.
Because the ultimate enemy was not Caesar. The ultimate enemy was sin and death. He chose to accomplish eternal spiritual salvation through his atoning blood, rather than temporary political liberation.
And so the authors argue that when the modern church prioritizes social restructuring over the gospel of repentance and faith, it is essentially repeating the error of the crowd at Bethsaida.
That is exactly their critique. And there is a third, equally weighty theological confrontation in these sources.
Right. The authors use this narrative to argue against Arminianism.
Specifically focusing on the debate between human free will and God's sovereignty.
Now, Arminian theology generally places a high emphasis on human autonomy and free will in the process of salvation and providence, right?
Yes. The idea is that God responds to, or at least heavily factors in, the autonomous choices of men.
But the sources we are analyzing, which are deeply rooted in Reformed theology, highlight the specific verbs Mark uses.
They argue that these verbs show Christ exercises total unilateral sovereignty over the human will.
It goes back to those intense words we discussed earlier: compel and dismiss.
Exactly. The authors argue that Christ does not wait for the disciples' permission to send them into the storm. He does not gently persuade them until they autonomously agree it's a good idea.
He forces them.
Right. And likewise, he does not take a poll to see if the crowd is ready to leave. He does not negotiate with their desires.
He forcefully disbands them.
The sources argue this proves that Christ governs the hearts, the actions, and the locations of men according to his sovereign decree, completely independent of human permission.
He's the potter, they are the clay.
That's the argument.
So if you are listening to this, consider how these critiques confront your own assumptions.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
Yeah.
Do you measure God's love for you by how easy your life is right now? Do you view Jesus primarily as a means to achieve social justice or political victories?
Or do you believe you are the sovereign captain of your own soul?
Right. Or do you recognize that Christ might compel you into a storm against your own will for your ultimate good?
Because if we take the events of this narrative seriously, God's providence is far more disruptive and far more sovereign than we usually want to admit.
But that disruption, that terrifying sovereignty, is actually the source of immense comfort.
It really is when you understand what Jesus is doing while we are in the storm.
Which brings us to the final movement of our deep dive: the sovereign intercession.
We have to look at the physical layout of this scene as a prophetic, typological portrait of the present day.
Think about the geometries of the narrative.
Yeah.
You have the disciples down below. They are trapped in the darkness, battered by the chaotic sea, exhausted, and they are literally fighting for their lives.
And elevated above them on the solitary mountain is Jesus.
Perfectly secure, in holy communion with the Father. The sources argue this prefigures the ascension.
It is a stunning parallel. Just as Jesus was on the mountain praying while the disciples fought the sea, the exalted Christ has now ascended into the heavenly sanctuary.
He is currently sitting at the right hand of God the Father.
And what is he doing there?
That's the question.
According to the authors, drawing on the broader theology of Scripture, he is not resting in a passive sense. He's making high priestly intercession for his storm-tossed militant church today.
It's like a spiritual control tower.
Oh, I like that.
But instead of an air traffic controller just watching a radar screen, seeing a plane struggle in a Category 5 hurricane, and just hoping for the best.
The one in this control tower is actively interceding.
Right. He actually controls the weather, he sees through the dark, and he is the one who personally commanded the flight path to begin with.
The controller isn't a passive observer wringing his hands. The storm doesn't cancel his command, and the darkness doesn't dissolve his care.
The disciples couldn't see him on the mountain. They thought they were abandoned to the waves.
But their inability to see him didn't mean he had ceased to govern them.
That is so powerful.
The sources draw a direct, comforting line to the believer today. We do not see Christ with our physical eyes. We are in the dark, straining at the oars of our daily lives, facing various tempests.
But he reigns on a heavenly mountain.
He sees our struggles, and he actively, effectively prays for us.
So how do we apply this ancient, profound text to, a Tuesday morning commute or a crisis at work or a difficult diagnosis? What is the practical takeaway from watching Jesus unplug the servers of his own popularity to go pray on a mountain?
The sources end with a very loud trumpet call to the necessity of private, solitary prayer.
Which is hard for us today.
It's incredibly hard. They argue that in our modern age, which is endlessly distracted, hyper-connected, and driven by algorithms, visibility, and metrics, we are suffering from a devastating functional prayerlessness.
We substitute frantic activity and social media chatter for deep communion with God.
We do. If we have a free moment, what do?
We pull out our phones.
We fill every second of silence with noise. But the argument here is piercing. If the sinless, eternal Son of God found it absolutely necessary to withdraw from a massively successful public ministry, to forcefully push away the adulation of thousands, just to spend hours in solitary prayer.
How much more do we need it?
Exactly. We are sinful, weak, and easily deceived by the world's metrics. The application is that we must ruthlessly carve out time for the secret place.
We have to decouple our spiritual worth from public visibility.
We have to relearn the discipline of dependent prayer.
We must ascend the spiritual mountain to commune with the Father, just as our mediator did.
We have covered incredible ground today.
We really have. We started with what looked like a simple travel itinerary in Mark 6.45-46, just 2 verses, and we discovered a magnificent dual portrait of Christ.
On the one hand, we see the sovereign king who commands with absolute, unyielding authority.
He forces his disciples into a storm for their own protection. He single-handedly dismisses a frenzied 10,000-strong mob, formally rejecting their false earthly glory and refusing to be a carnal-bred king.
And on the other hand, we see the dependent, obedient mediator.
It's a true human.
Yes, the true human who climbs a dark mountain to seek the face of the Father, perfectly modeling the communion that sustains the redemptive mission, and prefiguring his eternal high priestly intercession for us.
The authority that sends us into the storm is married to the infinite love that prays for us while we are in it.
Beautifully said. And that brings us to a final thought I know you want to leave the listeners with.
Yeah, I do. Because we want clear, easy formulas. We want A to lead to B. We want obedience to equal comfort.
But God's providence is far deeper and sometimes much darker than our fragile human logic.
So what is the takeaway for you listening right now? When you find yourself in the darkest part of the night, rowing against contrary winds that feel like they're tearing your life apart, exhausted and terrified.
What if it's not because you took a wrong turn?
Right. What if it's not because God has abandoned you? What if you are exactly where the sovereign interceding king commanded you to be for your good and his glory?
That reality changes everything about how we view our suffering. It turns the storm into a sanctuary.
It really does. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the surface, and remember who commands the wind. We'll catch you next time.